Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if your question doesn't get answered in this video, then please go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. Also, don't forget to post any new questions that you have. And also, don't forget to like all the questions that you want answered, because I generally answer them in order of how many likes they have. So let's jump right in. So Otaku asks, do you think the number of new words learned today should be dictated by the number of hours a person can actively immerse? For instance, if you immerse 3 or less hours, limit it to 10 new words. If you can do 3 to 5 hours, then 10 to 15 new words. And for 6+ hours, then 10 to 20 new words. Recently, I've seen a lot of newer people trying to do 20+ words a day, but only immersing an hour or so. Yeah, so I think that this is a question that doesn't have such a simple answer. I don't really think it's necessarily a matter of you're doing this many hours of immersion, therefore learn this many new words a day. Now, we can create kind of rules of thumb that take this format of, for this many hours learn this, but I'm going to try to explain my actual view of, in terms of actual efficiency, what is the mechanism between the relationship between how many new words you're learning per day and how many hours of immersion you're doing. So basically, I kind of think of it as there's different kind of strata of words or tiers of words. And one good way to conceptualize this could be the frequency star system that's included in the MIA dictionary add-on. So in case any people watching this don't know, inside of the MIA dictionary add-on, there is kind of a score given to each word you look up based off how frequent it is, or based off its position within a frequency list. And there's basically 5 levels. 6 technically if you count words that have 0 stars. So if a word is 5-star, that means that it's either one of the most 1,000 common words, or maybe it's one of the most 1,500 or 2,000 most common words. I don't remember exactly what the different boundaries between the different levels were, but it's something around there. And then if it's 4-star, that means that it's like in between 1,000 and then 3,000. And if it's 3-star, that means that it's like between 3,000 and something else. And I don't remember what the actual boundaries were. We did put a lot of thought into it when we were actually creating the system, and I can pull it up. It's somewhere. I probably should have done that before I started filming. But anyway, yeah, there's these tiers. And so then a 1-star word is extremely uncommon, and a 0-star word is like mega ultra uncommon, like you might never come across that word again. So now, of course, the boundaries between these different tiers or levels is something that we just kind of made up based off of what we thought would be most useful. But I'm just using this as a conceptualization. So if you wanted to, really, you could think of it as there's 10 different levels or 100 different levels. Ultimately, where you draw the lines are arbitrary, but it's just this idea that there are these different strata of words. And each strata, so if we're assuming that the first strata contains the most common words, each strata contains more total words than the last, So your first 1,000 words unlock a very high percentage of comprehension. You're not actually going to understand that much of the language, but just in terms of raw coverage, the most common 1,000 words can cover between like 70 and 90%, depending on what domain you're talking about, right? Whereas the next 2,000 words only give you like an extra 5 to 10% or something like that. Sorry if the exact numbers are off, but hopefully you get the main idea. And so we have these different tiers of words. And basically the way I think about it is that you want to be learning words that are on either the same tier or one tier above the kind of level that you've actually acquired. So, I talk a lot about the distinction between learning versus acquisition, and this is a really important concept when we're talking about learning words as well. So basically, there's going to be words that you have learned, meaning that you memorized, the reading and the meaning and the pronunciation, but you haven't actually acquired, meaning that when you actually hear the word, when you're listening to your immersion, it doesn't instantly register. You have to either it just goes over your head, or you have to think about it for like a second or two before it really clicks. And then there are words that you actually have acquired, where as soon as you hear it, you know it. You could, if you've acquired it deeply, then you can use it yourself naturally, and so on. And so basically, there's always going to be more words that you know than what you've acquired, because we're, based off the way I'm thinking about it, if you have acquired a word, then you automatically also know it. So you can't really have acquired a word but not know it, because if you've acquired a word, then if someone asked you what that word meant, you could just reflect upon your intuitive knowledge of the language and then give an answer, right? So I never officially learned like the word, I don't know, like gigantic in English, but I can tell you like, yeah, it means that something is very, very big, right? So anything that you've acquired, you technically also know. just trying to get my definitions precise here. So yeah, basically there's always going to be words that you know but haven't acquired. And so basically it's possible to acquire a word directly without learning it first, kind of like just through osmosis, through your immersion. But it's going to be a lot easier to acquire a word if you have learned it. And that's the whole point of using the SRS, right? You build all these mental dictionary entries, you learn all these words, and that, first of all, makes your immersion more comprehensible and also makes it easier to actually go on to acquire those words. I talked about that in my video, the role of the SRS. And so pretty much when going back to that idea of the tiers, it's very hard to like acquire a word that is like more than one tier above the level that you've acquired. So let's say that on an acquisition level, you've pretty much completed all 5-star words. So for like the vast majority of 5-star words, when you hear them, you understand them. Then in that case, you're going to be very prime or very ripe to acquire 4-star words. They're going to be like just beyond your horizon. You're like, your brain is just going to be starting to hone in on these 4-star words, and you're going to start noticing them more often in your immersion. They're going to become more accessible, and it's just going to start being very natural for you to acquire them. But if you're still at that point where you've just kind of completed the 5-star word strata and you're moving on to the 4-star word strata, then at that point, it's going to be a lot harder for you to acquire 3-star words, because 3-star words are just kind of too far, like they're too infrequent for you to really get a grasp of them at your current level. When you're at a higher level, you can still acquire words that are used very infrequently because your brain gets comfortable enough with the language where, like, even if you only see a word once a month, every time you do come across that one word, your brain is actually able to connect it to the last time you saw it last month and then the time you saw it before that, and still work on putting together this bigger picture. But before you're really comfortable in a language, then you're only going to be able to acquire words that show up very frequently. And so basically, your capacity to acquire infrequently used words grows as your fundamental ability rises. And so that's because of this principle or phenomenon, you want to be working on words that are at your right level, meaning that they're like at the current like star score you're working at, or right at the above one. And because if it's too far above your current like actual baseline level of acquired ability, then like even if you memorize those words, you're not really going to be able to acquire them very naturally. So basically, what all of this is kind of like leading up to, hopefully this actually makes sense, because this is like kind of a concept I've only like articulated to myself, like in response to reading this question, but I think it makes a lot of sense if you actually get what I'm saying. So basically, let's say that you have a learner who they, like, in their case, just hypothetically, they have acquired all 5-star words, and they have knowledge of all 4-star words, and now they're spending time gaining knowledge of 3-star words, but they haven't yet acquired very many 4-star words. In this case, this person, it wouldn't be a very good use of this person's time to be focusing on memorizing 3-star words, because they still have this whole strata where they have knowledge, but they haven't acquired it yet. So to this person, knowledge of 3-star words isn't going to be very helpful because it's going to be too out of reach. What they really need is to just immerse more so that they can integrate all of the knowledge that they have of the 4-star words and fully acquire them. And then once they have acquired all those 4-star words, then they're going to be really primed to start acquiring 3-star words, in which case it's going to be a good use of that person's time to memorize the 3-star words. And so basically, there's one way to articulate this idea is that you don't want the gap between what you've acquired and what you know, or what you've acquired and what you only know, meaning you haven't acquired, you don't want it to get too big. Otherwise, you're going to be memorizing words that are basically too infrequent for you to realistically be able to integrate into your knowledge in the short-term future. And it's going to be a better use of your time to just be immersing. But the opposite could be true, right? Where basically you pretty much have acquired every word that you know, and so your vocabulary growth is very slow because you're pretty much only learning words through osmosis. In this case, you would want to kick up the number of words that you learn per day so that you actually are creating this buffer. You're kind of creating words that are words that are accessible to you, meaning that they're not so infrequent that you're not going to be able to integrate them. They're kind of just beyond whatever your current horizon is. And you want to be learning lots of those words to prime yourself to acquire them. And that's going to help you speed up your vocabulary growth. So basically, what really matters is the gap between what you've acquired and what you know but haven't acquired. And there's kind of like a sweet spot. And depending on your learning history, this is going to be different from person to person. So, like, if you're someone who historically has been a very heavy Anki user and haven't really done that much immersion, then chances are there is a lot of words that you know but haven't integrated yet. And so it's going to be a better use of someone who's in this position's time to just focus on immersion and not be learning as many words, because they're not yet at a baseline level of acquired ability where they're going to be able to integrate the words that they would be learning if they were like studying words, right? Because since they know so many words, if they were going to memorize more words, those words would be very infrequent, but those infrequent words that are not going to be accessible to that person to actually acquire. So yeah, to kind of bring this more into kind of more practical terms, I would say that, like, if you're starting fresh, then it kind of makes sense that you have to kind of create this buffer, because you're going to start off, you don't know any words, right? Which is why I kind of say, like, at the very beginning of the process, just sit down, memorize the most common 1,000 to 2,000 words, because now you're creating this buffer. And then from that point onward, I would say if you're doing probably between 1 and 3 hours of immersion per day, then yeah, 10 words would be a good amount to learn. And if you're doing between like 3 and 6 hours a day, then maybe somewhere around 20 words would be a good amount. And for most people, I wouldn't really recommend going over 20 words per day, just because if you consistently do more than 20 new cards a day in Anki, then your reviews are going to get really bulky. And for a lot of people, like, having to sit down and do Anki reviews for 2+ hours a day is just so mentally taxing that it's not sustainable. Whereas it is pretty sustainable to do like giant hours of immersion a day, because immersion can be anything, right? It can be reading a book that you like, watching a TV show that you like. And so it's a lot easier to do it in mass quantities. So I'd say, like, to a point, the number of new cards per day and the number of immersion you do kind of like scale alongside each other. But eventually you hit this point where it's just not really realistic or feasible to do more new words per day in Anki than you have been doing. And so your immersion just keeps scaling while your Anki kind of stays the same. And that's kind of like what I did, right? Like, for me, I always pretty much only did 10 to 15 words a day. There was lots of a lot of time where I was just doing 10 words a day, even though I was getting tons of immersion, and that ultimately worked out fine for me. So I would say you kind of have to learn to just gauge in your own experience how far ahead your kind of knowledge bank, your like loaded up knowledge bank that you haven't yet acquired, how big that has gotten. Because you start to get an intuition for, like, are the words that I'm learning in Anki like actually useful to me? Are there things that I'm actually seeing in my immersion and that I'm going on to acquire? If so, that means you're probably in the sweet spot. If you feel like your vocabulary growth overall is just really slow, then maybe you want to pick it up. And if you feel like you're learning things in Anki that you never really see in your immersion, then that probably means that your knowledge base has gotten a little too far ahead of your acquired ability, and you want to focus more on just immersion and getting your baseline level up, so that you like gain the capacity to actually acquire words from your immersion that are very infrequently used. So yeah, I hope that made sense. This is kind of an idea I don't think I've ever talked about before, because like I said, I kind of just kind of like came to it as I was thinking. But let me know if that makes sense, and yeah, I'll try to work on refining my explanation of this concept, because I think if I could explain it in a way that didn't take 12 minutes and or 14 minutes I'm at now, and could explain it more succinctly, then I think it's a really powerful idea, because I think it's better to actually understand, like, what is the actual mechanism behind new words per day for a immersion. Like, what is actually happening here? Why is it good to do, for example, 10 new words a day if you have like 1 to 3 hours a day of active immersion? Like, where does that actually come from? Why is that the case? Rather than just having a kind of blind principle, I think it's good to kind of have this idea of, like, you're learning words that are just beyond your kind of like acquired horizon, because those are going to be accessible to you. And if you already have knowledge of all the words that you haven't yet that are like on your horizon but you haven't yet acquired, then learning more words means basically learning things that at your current level aren't really going to be useful to you and you're not going to be able to integrate, which means it's better to instead just focus on integrating that next level, that next tier that you haven't yet integrated. So it's kind of just that balancing thing, but I'm pretty much just saying the same thing over and over now, so I'm going to move on. So Callum asks, does subconscious language acquisition work the same when reading as when listening? It's easy to imagine when listening that there are subconscious processes working in the background, but when reading it feels more like the gains are from words and patterns that I consciously remember seeing before. But would that would that just be because when you read, you consciously go over all the words, but when listening, your conscious mind doesn't necessarily catch everything? Yeah, so very interesting question. Ultimately, I don't really know. And I don't know if we can know at this point in time, but what my intuition says is that they are slightly different because, like, basically the way that I think about it is that the way that infants acquire language is 100% subconscious. But the way that adults acquire language is, like, if you're taking an immersion-based approach, it's largely subconscious, but there's still a little bit more conscious action happening than is the case for an infant. And what I mean by this is, like, there are moments where you kind of consciously reflect on the meaning of a word, right? Or you consciously reflect on, like, what could this sentence mean given the current context? Or what does this structure mean? And is this usage of this structure different than the other one that I've seen? And so on. And so there is a little bit more conscious reflection at play that plays a role. And I do think that naturally this kind of conscious action that just happens naturally just as a result of trying to understand things probably is a little bit more active when reading versus listening, just because it can be, right? Like you said, listening, it goes by so quickly where there's really no time to be consciously reflecting on what's happening. I mean, there's time for a little bit, and you probably will do a little bit, but it's to the most part, it's kind of like it's so fast and there's so much that has to go on internally in order to understand that it really does feel largely like just a subconscious process where you're kind of just surrendering to the process and hoping that your brain does all the work for you. Whereas reading, it does feel more like solving a crossword puzzle. Not entirely, but it's more in that direction, right? Where you can stop and think about it, take your time, easier to look things up. And so I do think there is a little bit more of that conscious action that happens. But at the same time, when you really enter a flow state when you're reading, then I think it becomes more like listening. Like if you imagine the experience of like getting into a novel that you really like in your native language, like, you know, an hour or two might fly by where really you're just living in the story. You're living in the story that you're reconstructing internally. And there was no sense of like thinking about what words mean or anything like that. I mean, like maybe in the background there's a little bit of that, but for the most part it feels like when you're listening and you're just kind of absorbed in the content. So that definitely happens while reading. Although I would say, yeah, on average, you probably are going to be a little bit more conscious of the words and the structures than you would be while reading. And I'd say that's probably beneficial if you don't go overboard with it, right? Because I think if you actually let those conscious processes, those kind of conscious analysis processes, come too much into like if you let them become too front and center, then I think it can actually interrupt the subconscious acquisition process. So it's kind of a balancing act where you have to know like when is the right time to think a little bit more about this, and when is the right time to just kind of let go and let your mind kind of figure it out over time. And that balancing act is just something that you naturally get a hang for after you spend a lot of time language learning. It's something you just have to develop over time. There's no like clear principle or rule that you can just adopt blindly. But yeah, I would say probably you're going to be leaning a little bit more to that kind of conscious analysis side, just a little bit more on average when you're reading than listening. That's my kind of general sense of it. So DC Glot asks, hey Matt, I was wondering how you would go about optimizing MIA for the goal of getting to N1 as fast as possible. To clarify, I'm not viewing the JLPT level as a measure of ability, but rather a simple certificate that shows competence in Japanese. In the long run, my goal is to some degree native level ability, so I guess I'm not sure exactly what he wanted to say there. I guess he's saying he wants to get to native level ability outside of the domains tested. For context, I'm a recent high school graduate who's on a gap year, and while applying to colleges next year, I'd like some sort of certification to back me up in saying that I spent this time studying Japanese. I also think going from having no background in a language to the highest JLPT level in a year's time might seem impressive on my application. I know Stevie passed the N1 in about 1.5 years. So Stevie is this guy in the community who's using MIA to learn Japanese, and he's pretty much like just all-time MIA superstar who basically became fluent in 18 months and then passed the JLPT N1 starting from scratch with MIA. So yeah, I'll link his channel in the description of this video. He has, you know, update videos and other cool content. He's a rock star. But anyway, I think it'd be really cool if he's the next person you interview, by the way. Yeah, he might be. What do you think about his method? I don't remember exactly what his method is, by the way, but is there a way of getting there faster by, say, using all the Tongo books and optimizing your immersion content in some way? In my country, the test dates are in December and July. If you had all day and all the present day resources, how would you go about accomplishing this goal? Furthermore, what are some potential risks to overall Japanese ability from spending your first year studying for a goal like this, and how could you go about mitigating them? For example, if there's a problem with doing a large number of bilingual cards from Tongo, what if you did the N3 to N1 decks monolingually? So I gotta say, DC Glot, you have good questions. I see that you've been asking a lot of questions. If you could try to be a little bit more succinct, it would definitely be easier to answer them, because I had to record myself reading this question multiple times because it's just so long. Anyway, so your question is, how would I go about optimizing MIA for the goal of getting to N1? But it sounds like you're asking, how do I get to JLPT N1 as fast as possible? And if that is your goal, then I wouldn't optimize MIA. I would drop MIA and I would do something completely different than MIA in order to meet that goal. Because if all you want to do is pass the JLPT N1, then your best bet is just buying JLPT prep books and just Ankiing the entire thing from start to finish, and then taking a bunch of practice tests. That's the best way to get good at the JLPT. And if you grinded that all day, I imagine you could probably pass the JLPT N1 in like 3 months or something. I mean, I'm pretty sure a while ago I saw a video of a Korean guy who knew no Japanese, and he went from knowing no Japanese to passing the JLPT N1 in 3 months. Now, of course, Korean people have an advantage, but basically, yeah, if I think that would be possible to do. I mean, this guy, he also replies to this comment talking about where he's at with Japanese. Another very super long description that he gave of exactly where he's at Japanese. So he's not a 100% beginner. And so I would say, yeah, in that case, you could probably get there by December if you just, bought JLPT prep books and grinded them all day. There's really no point in doing immersion. I mean, you could do some immersion on the side, but like the JLPT is mostly like you can, if you just do lots of practice tests, you can get good at just like reading the multiple choice questions and then like skimming the paragraph to find the right information. And the listening test, they speak super slowly and unnaturally, and you can get good at just listening for the keyword. So if you really just want to pass the N1, I would say kind of like give up on MIA and just grind for that. But like Stevie, who, you know, the guy I just mentioned, he did pass JLPT N1 after 18 months, and he did a little bit of JLPT specific study at the end. I do remember that. I don't remember exactly what book he used or exactly how much he did, but it sounded like he pretty much just did MIA without worrying about the JLPT at all. Then a few months before the test, he bought a JLPT prep book, spent like a little bit of time, not that much time, kind of flipping through, maybe SRSing a couple things here and there that he didn't know, and then that was enough for him to pass it. So if you have kind of like that type of time scale, then I'd say that's the strategy I would recommend. Like if you have 18 months, I'd say for the majority of that time, just focus on actually learning the language and then just fill in any gaps at the very end with the prep book. That's what I would recommend. But if your just goal is like you just want to speed run from 0 to N1 as quickly as possible, then there's really no reason to immerse or to sentence mine or to do anything. Just grind stuff. And is there any potential risks? I mean, yeah, if you're taking this approach, then all the learning is going to be bilingual, and that's not ideal because you don't want to be like just reinforcing like this grammar pattern means this in English and this Japanese word means this in English. So it's not ideal. It's not going to be like detrimental in the long run. It's just kind of like going to be a lot of English patterns in your mind that are going to take a long time to kind of like unwind and undo. But I don't see any way to mitigate that without delaying the total time it would take to pass the test, right? Because it's like, yeah, you could incorporate more monolingual work, but that's going to make it take way longer. And so if you're, yeah, again, if your goal is just grind to the JLPT as quickly as possible, then I mean, probably just want to make use of doing everything bilingually, because that's just going to make it quicker to get to the point where you can pass that test, which is all that matters, right? Can you like get a high enough score on this game that ultimately is pretty much completely detached from actual Japanese ability? So yeah, I mean, I feel like I should have more to say, but ultimately that's it. I mean, and I can't really recommend you specific textbooks and stuff, because I mean, I'm not a JLPT guru, right? I'm not actually interested in passing the JLPT or helping people pass the JLPT. I'm interested in helping people cultivate real ability, and I know that anyone who cultivates real ability won't have any difficulties passing the JLPT. So I haven't spent any time at all looking into what JLPT textbooks exist, because it's like not part of what I'm interested at all. So I can't really give you recommendations on exactly what books to grind, but I would just get books that claim to cover everything the JLPT covers bilingually, and just make cards to memorize all of that, and then take a bunch of practice tests. And I think you should be able to pass the JLPT really quickly if you do that. So Kieran Brannigan asks, what do you think is the value of having Anki cards solely for repping pitch, accent / tones of individual words, in a similar way to vocab cards, but only focusing on the pitch, not the definition? I feel this could be especially useful in the beginning stages of trying to train the skill of recognizing pitch / tones. Have you had any experience with this? So if you were going to make cards just to basically learn or review the pitch or tones of individual words, there's two potential purposes that you might be doing this for. One of them is that you just want to have the knowledge of what tone a word is, or what pitch accent a word is, right? So maybe you understand pitch accent very well, you're fluent in Japanese, but you just realize that you don't know the pitch accent for like the word for rain, and so you're just gonna make a card just to remember the pitch of the word rain. So that's one possibility, or one possible purpose. The other purpose is that you're actually trying to train your perception. So you're trying to go from a place of not being able to actually perceive pitch, accent, or tones correctly to becoming able to perceive it correctly. And I just kind of want to clarify that these two things are completely separate, because like for me in pitch accent, right, I can perceive pitch accent perfectly. I can produce it with no problem at all. But there's still words in Japanese that I know, but I don't know the pitch accent of, just because I learned it before I was paying attention to pitch accent. So there's probably hundreds of words that are like this for me, where I'm reading a book, I come across a word, I know what the word means, I know it's like Connor reading and stuff like that, but I don't know what the pitch accent is. So maybe I would want to make a card just to remember the pitch of that word, so that if I ever want to use that word myself, I know how to pronounce it correctly. And I would do this occasionally when I was like using Anki more in the past and trying to catch up on pitch accent. But I mostly found that this wasn't really necessary, because when I was learning the pitch accents of words, I was already fluent in Japanese. And so because I was already fluent in Japanese and I was so familiar with the language, oftentimes if I looked up the pitch of a word that I already knew just one time, that would be enough for me to remember the pitch, and I'd never really forget it. Or maybe I'd forget it once, but then when I looked it up the next time after that, then I would never forget it. So I just kind of felt that it wasn't worth the time and effort to make and review cards just to learn the pitch, because just through immersing and looking things up on the fly, I could pretty much easily retain the pitch of words that I already knew. And for words that I didn't know yet, well, then that would be worth making a card for, because I'm also learning the reading and the meaning, and I would just learn the pitch alongside the reading and the meaning. So it would just be one piece of information within a card where I was learning all the different aspects of that word. So from that perspective, I personally didn't think, or I didn't really need to make words to memorize the individual pitch of words, because like I said, if I already knew the word, I could just remember the pitch without a card. And if I didn't know the word, well, then it's no longer a word just for the pitch, right? It's just a general card to learn the word. And I would recommend putting the pitch or tones on those types of cards. Now, I could see that perhaps if you were learning pitch when you had some foundation in Japanese, but you weren't totally fluent, And so it would have been harder for you to kind of catch up your knowledge of what the pitches of all the words that you already know are. Then maybe it would make more sense to learn, to basically make cards just to learn the pitches of words. So depending on where you are in the process when you start introducing pitch accent, and you know how easy it is for you to just memorize the pitch of words without making a card, then yeah, it's going to change. So I could see there being some portions of the process where, yeah, you do want to make some cards just to memorize the pitches of words, because, you know, there's like a couple thousand words that you know at this point, but you don't know the pitch of them, and you're still not totally fluent, so it's kind of hard for you to just remember the pitch without having any cards for it. So for some people, it might make sense to make those types of cards. But now let's talk about the other purpose, which is actually cultivating your perception. So yeah, when you first start learning Chinese or you first start learning Japanese, you're not going to be able to hear the tones or the pitch accent. But I don't really view Anki as a good tool to try to train your perception, because the Anki algorithm is optimized for memories. And your perception, like your ability to actually like perceive the rises and falls of pitch when you're listening to words pronounced in a foreign language, that is completely different than a memory, right? That's more like it's almost a physical skill, right? And so I think the kind of curve of like knowledge, not really knowledge, like the curve of like how ability is cultivated and maintained when we're talking about a skill like hearing things correctly, is going to be totally different than like the forgetting curve, which is based off of memories and knowledge. And so, like, you know, Anki's default algorithm is like, okay, you learn a new thing, you see it the next day, then you see it in 3 days, then like 7 days, then, you know, 2.5 weeks. And I mean, I'm probably getting the specifics wrong, but you know what I mean, right? It's like, it has this particular pattern that is based off of human memory, and it works very well for retaining information. I mean, sometimes you have to tweak it a little bit, but it works really well. But if we were going to say like, okay, I want to get better at like throwing a basketball into a hoop, then you wouldn't want to like practice like 1 day and then 3 days and then 7 days, right? It doesn't work like that, because it's not knowledge. It's an actual embodied skill. And so instead you would probably want to practice every day for a while, and until you actually had that ability down, right? And so Anki, just the way the algorithm works, it's not built to be a tool to help you kind of train skills in this way. I think you would need a whole different kind of like curve of practice. And so I think it would be possible to basically make a tool that specifically trained your perception. Like, there actually are little quiz games. I don't think it exists for Japanese pitch accent, maybe. But I know there are little games for like just practicing the tones, where it just plays you a word and then you have to say what tone it is. And you can just play this game as long as you want. And I can see the potential of maybe playing these games helping you cultivate the perception. But again, you wouldn't want to do it in the way that you do it with Anki. You might want to just do it for like 15 minutes to a half an hour a day, every day, until basically you're just perfect at it. And then you would probably just stop doing it altogether, because at that point you can already hear it correctly. And so just through doing immersion, you would maintain your ability to hear the tones or hear the pitch accent correctly. So I do think that, yeah, maybe it makes sense to have some kind of like explicit training, some kind of deliberate practice revolving around your perception. I mean, it's definitely not necessary, because like for pitch accent, I never did this. I mean, I did it a little bit for Chinese tones, but I didn't really do it, because if you just make an effort to listen for the tones whenever you're immersing in the language, then you naturally gain the ability to hear them over time. So I don't really see, like, I definitely can say with certainty that there's no need to do some kind of like explicit, deliberate, like isolated, deliberate practice around your perception. But for all I know, maybe doing that is useful and actually speeds up the process. So we'd have to like kind of run studies to see if that's the case. Even if it does speed up the process, I don't think it's going to be like a huge night and day difference, so I wouldn't really get too worked up about it. But I could see that, hey, maybe someone makes this app that helps you like train your perception and isolation, and that does lead to like your listening ability growing more quickly later down the line, or your pronunciation getting better more quickly later down the line. I could see that as a possibility, so I think there is more to explore there. But again, I wouldn't really use Anki as that tool, because the algorithm is designed for helping you retain the memories of knowledge that you have, not cultivate new embodied skills. So those are my thoughts on that. So Joey Jordanson asks, I have a question regarding output ability. I am a firm believer that early output can do your accent harm in the future. However, I was wondering if there's a certain point that you should be able to output even if it's very low quality. For example, I'm at a point where I can barely use the where I barely have to use the bilingual dictionary at all and know several thousand words. I can also read fairly comfortably at about a level 4 in reference to your Q&A a month ago. However, despite understanding a large amount of Japanese content, I still cannot formulate a sentence in my head at all. I'm totally fine with this, but I just wanted to know if this should normally be the case at my level. The reason I ask is because I've heard you say that when you were at only about 6 months of age you were able to speak Japanese to your host family even though it was a low quality of output. Yeah, interesting question. So I think the answer is kind of yes and no. In my case, I had 2 years of traditional classroom style learning before I started to do AJAT. And in that traditional classroom style learning, you're basically playing that game where you're memorizing formulas that allow you to translate your English thoughts into Japanese thoughts, and then you're forced to like practice doing this internal translation thing. And so when I was 6 months into AJAT and I like was doing low quality output, a lot of that was playing that game of like thinking in English and then translating my thoughts. And like, yeah, it works, just the result is very low quality, and that process is largely like unrelated to the process of learning how to speak a language like naturally and fluently. So maybe the reason, I would say probably the reason why I could speak as well as I did at the 6 month mark was because I had practiced doing traditional learning, but I wouldn't recommend that because, like I said, that process of like memorizing formulas to translate your thoughts, like not only is it completely unrelated to the process of actually acquiring a language and learning how to produce it naturally, but it also creates lots of bad habits and things like that. And I think the reason why I was able to mostly end up not really suffering from a lot of bad habits was because I had a very long silent period as soon as I got back from Japan. And again, my output quality was very low when I was in Japan. I actually have some videos of myself speaking that are super cringy, and I'm too embarrassed to release, at least at this point in time. So there is that. But I do think that like someone who's in your position, who knows thousands of words and who can actually read a lot of Japanese, if you actually tried, you probably could output more than you think that you can. Like right now, I know it kind of feels like, okay, I'm going to speak Japanese, and then nothing comes out. But if you like really forced yourself to, like if you actually visualized that you were like in Japan and you needed to ask a question and you were having an emergency, like you would be able to spit something out, right? Even if it's just a bunch of like disconnected words, you would be able to like spit a lot of stuff out. And if you actually start trying to do this, like trying to start spitting stuff out, I bet that within like maybe even an hour, you could find that you actually can form basic sentences. Just even the reason why you probably feel like you can't is because if you were going to force yourself to form these, like, to just basically throw words out and shove them into sentences, it would just feel so wrong because you would be able to feel that it's like incorrect and unnatural and just unnative. Like you could tell that you're creating something that looks like Japanese but isn't actually real Japanese. And because that feels so kind of like off-putting and just bad, you feel like you're not even really willing to consider that as an option. Like you don't even think of that as actually outputting because you're just like, no, that's just creating like gross abominations. That's not output. But in reality, like that is low quality output. And so like if you think about listening to people speak English, there's a lot of times I've heard Japanese people basically go like, you know, I'm not going to try to replicate the pronunciation, but basically be like I go store, where store, like where I go store or whatever. Like you can basically have had like 1 week of English classes and like form this level of sentence. And so when you think about it from this point of view, there's like no way that you can't at all output if you actually know thousands of words and have spent a lot of time reading Japanese. So I think it's kind of a matter of like, if you wanted to output, then you just kind of have to force yourself to get the gears turning. And I've actually kind of been formulating this analogy that I'm kind of ambivalent about, that it basically goes something like this. Output is kind of like a toothpaste tube, where you know how the more toothpaste you have in a tube, the easier it is to get toothpaste out of it. So when you first buy a brand new toothpaste tube, it's completely full, and a lot of times you'll accidentally like squeeze out too much toothpaste because just the slightest amount of pressure leads to toothpaste shooting out of the end. But as you start to use up all the toothpaste in a tube and you run on the low end, then it gets harder and harder to get the toothpaste out. And eventually you're at this point where you have to like roll it up and like squeeze it and apply a lot of pressure to get the last little bit out. And so the relationship between input and output in a foreign language is kind of the reverse of this. At the beginning, you start at the point where there's just like a little bit of toothpaste in your like metaphorical toothpaste tube. And if you really force it, you can get something out. And this might be where you're at right now. And like I said, you probably don't want to force it because it doesn't feel very good to do so, but you probably could if you forced yourself to. You probably could output at a pretty low quality level if you just forced yourself to do it for like an hour or two. I bet you would find that you actually could do it. But then the more input you get, the more your toothpaste tube gets full, and eventually it gets to the point where you're essentially fluent in the language even though you've never spoken it before. This is what happened to me. Kind of sounds like this is what happened to that guy Stevie too, if you watch his video, where he has a video of him speaking pretty much for the first time. Like, he's never really spoken before, but he just filmed himself speaking, and he's essentially completely fluent in the language. So if you wait long enough, you can eventually get to the point where your toothpaste tube is so full where you go from having never spoken before to essentially being fluent. And a lot of European people in the community who I've seen basically are this way with English, where they never actually speak English in their day-to-day life because they live in like Germany or France or somewhere else in the world, but they spend a lot of their time consuming English content. And so when it comes time for them to speak English, they are fluent in the language. Now, they're not perfect, they still have an accent, they still make grammatical mistakes, they still say some unnatural stuff, but for the most part, they're very fluent. Like, no doubt about it. They can communicate no problem, and they're like far better at English than almost any Japanese people I've ever seen. And so this is like an example of like these people who their metaphorical toothpaste tube is completely full, right? They've gotten so much input that they become able to output at a pretty high level, even without any explicit practice. And so depending on what your final goal is and what your situation is, you might choose to begin the output process at different points of your the fullness of your toothpaste tube, right? Some people that are basically like Benny the Polyglot style, they just like, they're not really care about getting good. They just want to communicate with people. They just want to go out and enjoy themselves and maybe like, just have some fun getting complimented by a native speaker when they can introduce themselves. And so they just force out whatever little bit they have, even though their toothpaste tube is virtually empty. Other people, maybe they focus for like the first 6 months on immersion. They get their toothpaste tube like halfway full, and then they start outputting pretty regularly, even though it takes a little bit of effort, and they continue to get immersion or input alongside that. And then other people, maybe they're willing to wait 18 months or more, maybe even 2 or 3 years, until that point where their toothpaste tube is completely full. And it's going to depend, which one of those makes most sense to you is going to depend on your goals and your life situation and things like that. So yeah, maybe hopefully that shined some light on whatever you were, or on the question that you were asking. So Jim P asks, hey Matt, during stage 2 of the new roadmap, how big or small should the domain we choose to reach mastery in be? For instance, can we pick a small domain like slice of life anime, fully master it, reading and listening, and then move on to our output domain? Or should we choose something as large as the entire domain of anime? Does the size of vocabulary in the domain matter? So good question. So he's asking about home domains. So yeah, in the new MIA roadmap, basically stage 1 is just about gaining a foundation in, the writing system, in basic vocabulary, grammar, things like that. And then in stage 2, you really start learning from your immersion directly. And the goal of stage 2 in the new roadmap is to basically become able to understand your home domain at a pretty high level. And so this home domain is basically just the first domain that you gain comfort in. And so, yeah, talking about the scope or size of your home domain. So I'd say that basically the more narrow of a domain that you choose as your home domain, then the more efficiently that you're going to be able to progress, because what you're doing when you're exposing yourself to a limited range of input is you're basically exposing your brain to more consistent patterns. And what language acquisition really is pattern recognition. And so the more consistent the more consistent that the patterns you expose your brain to are, the more quickly your brain's going to be able to basically like solve or figure out those patterns, and then the more quickly you're going to progress. So the most efficient way to progress would be to have like, a very narrow home domain like slice of life anime or something like that. The downside is that having a narrow domain means that you're watching a bunch of the same type of content, which is inherently really boring and tedious. And if it's too boring and tedious, then you're not going to do it, and then all efficiency goes out the window because you don't even reach your goal of getting good at the language. So I think you got to kind of balance these two things of having variety to keep things interesting, but having it narrow to keep things efficient. And where exactly you're going to fall on this spectrum depends on who you are personally, right? Maybe some people, they're just like a language learning machine, and they're like, I can actually do this. I have an iron will. I'm just going to watch nothing but like moe anime and do that until I acquire it. Or maybe they just love moe anime so much that it's not a big deal. Whereas other people, they'll be like feeling like they want to blow their brains out after trying to just watch nothing but one type of content, and so they have to just introduce more variety to keep it fun and interesting. And so I'd say maybe play around with it and like see what feels best for you, but ultimately just think about it in terms of those trade-offs. And I would say even if your domain is like basically if your domain is hyper narrow, which I would define as like even more narrow than like slice of life anime. Hyper narrow would mean like maybe like the only content that you've consumed is like dialogues out of a textbook, and these are like contrived dialogues that have a very limited range of vocabulary. So like it's like artificially almost narrow in scope. In that case, then you might have to acquire a couple domains before you're ready to move on to stage 3, which is when you start worrying about output. Because basically what you're doing in stage 3 is you're choosing an output domain, which is the first domain that you're actually going to speak and write in. And then first you're going to learn to understand that, and then you're going to actually produce it yourself. And so if you don't have enough of a foundation in the language, then you're not really going to be able to move on to stage 3 because it's going to take you too long to like acquire your output domain. So if you're choosing something that's like hyper narrow, then maybe you might have to acquire like 1 or 2 or 3 like hyper narrow domains before you could complete stage 2 and move on to stage 3. But for most people, I don't think this is going to be a problem because like slice of life anime is already wide enough that it's going to do the job of giving you that foundation that you need to complete stage 2. Or maybe I just thought of this. I think this was the thing I was like reaching for, but I couldn't remember a little bit like a few moments ago. By hyper narrow, using one show, for example, might be an example of something that's hyper narrow. Like if you in either the last Q&A or the one before that, I talked about the possibility of basically using a single show as your home domain, like just using One Piece, the anime, as your home domain, and how I do think that actually might be a really good option because, like I said, you get that narrowness that allows you to learn really, really efficiently because you're feeding your brain very consistent patterns. But that show alone might not be enough for you to complete all of stage 2 because the language used is so narrow that ultimately you don't have enough of a foundation yet. So maybe you master one show and then you go on to master like a second show or a third show. And then at that point, after you've mastered those 3 shows in combination form enough of a domain or enough of a foundation for you to move on to stage 3. So basically, I would say the narrower the better, with the 2 caveats of, first of all, don't try to force yourself to do something too boring or it's not going to be sustainable. And second of all, if it's too narrow, you might have to acquire a couple domains before you can move on from stage 2 to stage 3. But that's not a problem at all. It's still, ultimately, it might be the most efficient thing to do. So Grave Stacy asks, after learning standard Japanese dialect, did you find it difficult to understand other dialects like Kansai-ben, or was this something that naturally became comprehensible through immersion? So, well, when you're talking about learning Japanese dialects, Kansai-ben is kind of an exception because it's so prevalent within greater Japanese culture. So even if pretty much you're trying to just stick to standard Japanese input, you're going to come across Kansai-ben just because a lot of anime have like at least one character who speaks Kansai-ben, or like most Japanese comedy is done in Kansai-ben. And so it's just so prevalent that there's no way you're gonna not come across it sooner or later when you're learning Japanese. And so basically what happened in my case was I was mostly focusing on standard Japanese, but Kansai-ben would just pop up every now and again. And so over time, I just picked up little bits and pieces of it. And another thing is that a lot of times the Kansai-ben in anime isn't like true Kansai-ben. It's kind of like watered down Kansai-ben. And the reason for this is that like true Kansai-ben might actually be difficult for some Japanese people who aren't from Kansai to understand, because they have their own slang, you know, and it can be quite different. And so a lot of times the Kansai-ben that you come across when you're mainly engaging in standard Japanese input is kind of like a watered down form of Kansai-ben that's kind of a little bit closer to standard Japanese than like true authentic Kansai-ben is. And that's just because they, you know, anything that you see on like mainstream Japanese TV has been created such that anyone in Japan can understand it. And so they're not going to use any like true Kansai-ben slang that is unique to like Osaka or anything like that, because that risks like making something that would be incomprehensible to a larger Japanese audience. And so because of this, it's pretty easy to figure out Kansai-ben through just like watching anime over time and like learning from the few characters that speak Kansai-ben, because it's not true Kansai-ben. It's kind of this like dumbed down version where it's basically just like, it's almost like you could take a standard Japanese sentence, do like find and replace for sentence enders, and then you have like Kansai-ben. So it's very simple. It's like they call it a different dialect, but like ultimately it's just different sentence enders, right? So it's very formulaic. It's not hard to understand that they say like, you know, se instead of sol. So they say se ana instead of sol da na, or something like that. And then they say ya instead of da. So they say like, you know, like akada or akaya instead of akada, or something like that. And instead of saying like nai, like wakara nai, they say like wakara hen. So they say hen instead of nai. Like there's a very small number of these just like conversions that you just memorize, and then you pretty much understand Kansai-ben, or at least you understand the watered down version of Kansai-ben that appears within like standard Japanese media. And so I never had to like sit down and study Kansai-ben. I just picked up these little conversions here and there, and before I knew it, I like pretty much knew Kansai-ben. Now, for a while, if I actually heard like real authentic Kansai-ben, I wouldn't understand that much of it, because like the pitch accent was different and it's like just really fast, and they like slur things in different ways. It just sounds different. So it's like harder to understand. But I think I had like a period of time where I listened to like a lot of manzai and Kansai-ben, like for a period of a couple weeks. That was like all I immersed with. And then after that, I could understand Kansai-ben like no problem. And then there are other like words that are only used in Kansai-ben, like futekoi is one, and there's like some other words. So whenever I would come across a word that was like only used in Kansai-ben, then I would just make a card for it, just make a sentence card, and then I would learn it, and then I would know what that word means. And so learning to understand Kansai-ben is not hard at all. Basically, you just pick up little bits and pieces here or there, part of the conversion, and then if you really want to lock it in, then like once you're pretty decent at the language, then just spend a few weeks like listening to manzai, and then you'll be good. Now with other dialects, it's kind of a similar thing where there's a watered down version and a real version. So if I want to, like right now at the point where I'm at with Japanese, like let's say I watch a movie that takes place in like some inaka where they speak some kind of like Hogen, like some kind of regional dialect. In that context, it's because Japanese movies are created so that they can be understood by anyone anywhere in Japan. Again, it's not going to be the true dialect. It's going to be a kind of watered down version of the dialect so that it's like comprehensible to people who speak standard Japanese. And because of this, normally I can pretty much understand like 90% of the dialects just by default, because like I'm so familiar with Japanese that like my brain can like work around the little parts that are different, and I can still understand like the vast majority of it. And then within like 20 minutes of watching, let's say, a movie with a new dialect, I just like figure out naturally what the conversions are, and then I understand it like 99%. Like I remember when I watched the show like years ago, when I watched the show Kids on the Slope, that takes place in somewhere in Kyushu. I don't remember exactly where, but there's a dialect that they speak there where instead of using the particle o, or like wo, you know, like for the like direct object, they use ba. And for e adjectives, they replace the e with a ka. So instead of saying like kakkoi, they say kakkoyoka. And instead of saying e, they say yoka, because it's yoi, but yoka. And then instead of saying like ne, they say bai. So they'd be like like kakkoyoka bai, or something like that. And then like for the ba, they might be like gohan ba taberu, or something like that. So instead of gohan o taberu. And so that was pretty much, there's like a few other little things, but that's like the bulk, that's like the whole dialect in terms of the show. So it took me like a couple minutes to like figure out these conversions, and now I instantly understand the dialect. But again, that's not that's not a true regional dialect. That's kind of like a watered down version of the dialect that they put into the show so that anyone anywhere in Japan would realistically be able to understand it. So in terms of those watered dialects that show up in media, no problem for anyone who pretty much is like actually good at Japanese. But in terms of actual regional dialects, then that is like a lot harder, and that depends on the dialect. So like if I was actually going to go to like Akita Ken, Akita Prefecture, and then just try to talk to like a random guy who like, I mean, nowadays probably all young people in Japan, everywhere in Japan, can speak standard Japanese. So it wouldn't really be an issue because they would probably just speak standard Japanese to me. But if I like went to some older person who like actually speaks Akita-ben or something like that, I probably would not be able to understand them. But probably the average like Japanese person who grew up in Tokyo would not be able to understand them either. And I've heard lots of people report this. Like my girlfriend's grandpa is from Akita, and she's like, yeah, I can't understand half the stuff that he says. And so when you're talking about real regional dialects, that would be I mean, I wouldn't say it would be hard. You just have to like spend some actual time listening to it. Like maybe you have to spend like 50 to 100 hours listening to that dialect, and then you become able to understand it with like, 99% comprehension. And so if you wanted to do that, you'd have to actually find like authentic input that uses a dialect, which is really hard to do for anything but Kansai-ben, right? So it's like, where are you going to find 100 hours of like authentic Akita-ben content? I don't know. But if you actually went there and like hung out with people from Akita, then like you could probably do that. So it wouldn't be hard. I'd say it'd probably just take like 50 to 100 hours of like actually listening to it. But it's also something that like doesn't really matter because, like I said, all young people, like probably everyone in Japan below the age of 30 can speak standard Japanese. At least like mostly speak standard Japanese. Maybe their pitch accent is like a little off, or like they throw in some words here or there, but it's like they can speak like mostly standard Japanese. And second of all, even like people who are born and raised in Tokyo like can't understand most like true regional dialects, I don't think. So like they couldn't understand two like grandpas from Akita, or two people from like some random inaka talking amongst themselves when they're using all their like regional dialect slang and stuff like that. So I don't really think it's something you have to tackle that much, because it doesn't really matter, because it's like what are you trying to accomplish? Like, you want to be able to like talk to grandpas from some random countryside in Japan? Like, I mean, everyone has different goals, but I'm not really that interested in that. And the other thing is that there are some dialects that are so different from standard Japanese that they're essentially completely different languages. Like, there's two different dialects, or maybe three, can't remember, spoken in Aomori, that like they sound closer to Korean or French than Japanese. And there's like, and also like Kagoshima-ben, there might be a different term for it, but like there's a language spoken in Akita which like it's so different from Japanese, it sounds like a completely different language. And there was actually like a viral clip going around of someone from Kagoshima like talking, and it was just so funny that it went viral among Japanese people, because it sounds so funny to like someone who speaks standard Japanese. So I'll try to find that clip and put it in. But basically, yeah, there are different degrees to how different dialects are from standard Japanese. So I'd say for most, they're close enough where it'd just take 50 to 100 hours to kind of get a hang of it. But there's other ones that you pretty much would have to learn as a completely different language if you wanted to. But again, I don't really think it's something to worry about, because those dialects are kind of dying out. More and more of Japan is moving in the direction of standard Japanese. Even authentic Kansai-ben is moving more in the direction of standard Japanese. And so for the most part, it's like, learn standard Japanese, learn to understand Kansai-ben, and then maybe even learn to speak Kansai-ben if that's what you're into. But beyond that, I don't really think it's worth worrying too much about dialects, because like I said, as long as you have a good handle on standard Japanese, you'll be able to understand everything that exists in the media, which is all that you probably really care about. Okay, so make this the last question. John K asks, this question is in response to several questions I've seen from new people on the Discord. Can you talk about the reasoning for holding off early grammar and vocabulary until after recognition RTK? I got past the beginner phase before I found MIA, but I feel like if I were to go back to the starting line, I would throw in some mild grammar and vocab study while doing the RRTK deck. In theory, wouldn't that provide some much needed foundation in the very early immersion? Well, I mean, I don't think it ultimately matters like too much either way. So it's like, yeah, you could do that if you want. Like, that'd be totally fine. The reason why I didn't structure it like that in the MIA Japanese Quick Start Guide is because, like, first of all, well, just on like a very pragmatic level, right? Like, let's say you're trying to learn grammar from Take Him. All the example sentences are written in kanji, and they're written using words. And so if you don't know any kanji, it's going to be hard to try to consume grammar content because you can't read words. And how can you consume grammar content without like knowing the words? And so there's that kind of issue. And then with learning words, right? It's like, well, before you finished RRTK, you're not really going to feasibly be able to learn the kanji readings of words. So then you're pretty much just learning the pronunciation and the meaning of them. And then after finishing RRTK, you have to go back and then relearn the kanji of them. So that just kind of seems like, well, instead of like learning kanji and then vocabulary and grammar alongside each other, which first of all is kind of difficult because now you're juggling three different things, right? You're trying to do the kanji, and then you got to do your words, and then you got to do your grammar. So like, in addition to having the struggle of now, the process is like inherently more complicated because you're literally juggling more things at once and you're not focusing in as much. But also it's like, okay, so now you're like learning words alongside kanji, but you're not learning the kanji of those words. So then after you finish RDK, you have to like go back and then learn the readings of the kanji, which kind of seems inefficient. And then again, with the grammar, it's hard to learn the grammar before you know any words, and then you can't like no. I mean, maybe there's some grammar textbooks that don't use any kanji at all, so this wouldn't be a problem. So like, yeah, if you wanted to, if you found a grammar resource that didn't use any kanji, then you could start going through that alongside RRTK, like 15 minutes a day. I think that'd be totally fine. That would make sense. Take Him wouldn't work for that, but Take Him isn't even that amazing of a resource anyway. So, and I imagine like most Japanese resources, you know, they teach you kanji super slowly. So I imagine that actually probably a lot of Japanese grammar resources don't like make it so that you can still learn the grammar through that resource without knowing kanji. So yeah, the grammar would be fine. For the words, I kind of just feel like, yeah, instead of spending like half your time learning kanji and half your time learning words and then having to go back and like relearn part of the word, I feel like it makes sense to just like do all kanji so that you finish the kanji more quickly, and then you can just focus on words and learn the words like fully from the beginning. And by fully, you know, I mean obviously you can't like fully learn a word just in the SRS, but like learn the actual reading, pronunciate, like the how to read it, how it's pronounced, and what it means. And so yeah, and I think again it just makes the process more simple because it's like, okay, first you're doing RTK, then vocabulary. It's like just makes the process more streamlined, more straightforward, I feel like. And again, now in the very beginning stages, I'm just going to tell people to immerse with English subtitles. And I had a really long rant in the last Q&A about why that is. And I think I have a really good argument for it. So if you haven't heard that rant, I recommend going and listening to that. But yeah, now people are going to be using English subtitles anyway during the beginning stages. So it's like, isn't really an issue that they're not going to be understanding that much. Like, yeah, if you were just going to be sitting and watching raw anime for like an hour a day in the very beginning and you didn't know any words at all, that wouldn't really be very efficient. And I would agree, okay, maybe we got to like find a way to throw some words in there so that they can at least have something to be listening out for when they're doing that immersion. But now that they're going to be using English subtitles at the very beginning, and the purpose of the immersion is more just to help build a habit, then yeah, I don't really see that as an issue anymore. So yeah, ultimately, I think it's just a matter of how yeah, it's better to do one thing at a time instead of trying to multitask. And then there's that issue, like again, with having to learn words. Like basically go back and relearn the readings of words after you finish the kanji. Grammar, as long as you find a resource that doesn't rely on knowing kanji, I think it's totally fine to do that during RRTK. Ideally, there would be something that kind of like there would be some kind of integrated like kanji plus vocabulary course where, because like basically to learn the kanji efficiently, you have to learn them in an order based off the components. But the downside of that is that the order of the components is completely different from the order of frequency. And so you have to learn some infrequent kanji before frequent kanji. But maybe I could make some course where it's like I take the 1,000 most common words and I make it so that every time you've learned a kanji for a word and you kind of like unlock that word because you've learned that point, then you learn that word in the middle of learning kanji. So there'd be this bigger deck that teaches you vocabulary and kanji, and it would be based off the order of the kanji because it's important to learn them in the component order to like learn them efficiently. But then whenever you would unlock a word that exists on the list of the most common like 1,000 or 2,000 words, then you would learn that word right there. And maybe that would be good because then you get to like learn words alongside kanji and it's more integrated. And because like I know it is pretty tedious to be like, I'm just going to work on kanji for like 2 whole months before I get to start learning words. And that is still kind of like a pretty high barrier to entry. So yeah, maybe I could do something like this in the future. It's one of those things you got to try it out before you'll know if it's a good idea or not. But yeah. So okay, actually I just realized there's another question here that looks like it'll probably be pretty quick. So I'm just gonna do one more, even though I said the last one would be the last one. Andrew asks, comprehension of news in all caps for some reason, is often considered to be the hardest thing to comprehend, both for learners and even native speakers of Chinese and Japanese. I asked my native Chinese girlfriend, and she says that she says she has trouble comprehending Chinese news/political discussions fully. Agree with this assertion? My native language is Russian, and I consume virtually zero, all caps, input in the language for decades. I speak probably at the level of a 10-year-old. However, for fun, I put on Russian news podcasts, and I can understand 100%. Do you think there is something inherent to Chinese and Japanese to the Chinese and Japanese languages that make them inherently difficult to comprehend news and politics, even for native speakers? So, I'm not really at the point with my Chinese where I can comfortably speak to how hard the news is to understand. But for Japanese, the news is not hard to understand. Like, I mean, if you actually are an immersion learner and you actually spend ample time with the language, you actually like get good, so to speak. Learning to understand the news is not hard. It's like spend a couple weeks just immersing with the news for all of your immersion and you'll figure it out. Like assuming you already have a basic foundation. I never found the news that hard. I mean, I never even really grinded the news. I pretty much learned how to understand Japanese news just from the scenes within anime and Japanese movies and Japanese dramas where news would be on the TV inside of the scene. Like, I learned how to understand Japanese news just from those scenes, pretty much. And so yeah, I don't think the news is hard to understand in Japanese if you actually like can read Japanese. Like, yeah, I can imagine that if you couldn't read Japanese, you didn't know kanji, then maybe learning to understand the news would be hard because there's a lot of kanji compounds and stuff. But assuming that you can actually read Japanese to a decent level, then like learning to understand the news is not difficult. It just takes a couple weeks of practice, really. And so that's that. For Chinese, I don't know. Maybe it is a lot harder in Chinese because it's all just giant kanji compounds or Hanzu compounds. And I mean, I definitely struggle in Chinese with the fact that so many words sound similar to each other and there's so many homophones and stuff. Or homonyms, forget which one's which, but yeah, so words that sound the same even though they mean different things. So maybe the news is harder to understand in Japanese or in Chinese. Can't really speak to that, but in Japanese, the news is definitely not the hardest thing to understand. I would say understanding the news is significantly easier than just understanding, like, for example, late night radio where people are talking fast and really blurry, or like understanding Fate Zero or like Ghost in the Shell, where there's tons of crazy sci-fi words that don't even exist, that like aren't even in the dictionary. So yeah, news is like mid-tier level difficulty, not even really in the high tier, I would say. So yeah, that's about it for this Q&A. Sorry if I was rambly. Filming this a little bit later in the day than usual, so I feel like I wasn't able to be as succinct. Not that I'm able to be succinct usually, but yeah, sorry for that. But yeah, thanks so much for supporting. We hit 1,500 patrons, which is awesome. It's the end of the month right now, so we might have dipped back under. It always goes down a little bit at the end of the month. Oh no, well, at least as at the time of this recording, we're still under, so that is awesome. The goal for 1,500 patrons was to get someone to design the site, and actually, a patron messaged me who's a web designer and offered to make the site, and he's already kind of showed me some of the ideas that he has, and it's looking really good. So yeah, looking forward to that. It's probably going to be like, I know I said a month ago that the new site would be out at the beginning of September, which is like in a couple days from when I'm recording this. So that didn't happen. If you've been kind of watching what's happening in the community, you could probably guess as to why that is. Got so a little bit of other stuff going on right now, but hopefully I'll be able to get to that soon. And I'm also thinking of maybe, instead of like just writing the whole new site and releasing it, maybe like releasing the articles as I finish them for like patrons to see. And that way I wouldn't feel as rushed like working on the site, because like if I'm going to finish the whole new version of the site before I release it, then you guys like can't see anything until it's 100% done. So I have this like pressure, like I have to rush, because otherwise it looks like I haven't done anything. But if I release it like article by article, then like I'll even like just to you guys as patrons, then like you guys can see that like I'm working, and that I think that will just help me like go at my own pace and get feedback from you guys and stuff. So tell me what you guys think about that idea. And yeah, and just to clarify, it's not like I'm going to write every single article on the site, but basically just the new core content, like the new roadmap, the new like short stage guides, like just 1 or 2 pages for each stage, and then a couple of the theory articles in terms of like levels of comprehension and home domain and stuff like that. Just kind of like that core content. There'll still be a lot more content to like flesh out going forward, but yeah, there's kind of like a bare minimum I need before I can like release the site, because like, yeah, once I release the new roadmap, then a lot of the content on the old site will be irrelevant and stuff like that. But yeah, been rambling for a while, so I'll cut it off here. So yeah, thanks so much for supporting. Post your questions, and good luck with your guys' studies.